Hello, this is Dan Pro. Welcome back to another section of my Rigify tutorial series, and in this section we're actually going to talk about one of the things that I really glossed over in the last part with when we actually parented our mesh object to our armature object. So we know that our mesh object is made up of edge loops and vertices and faces, and an armature object is made up of bones. So two different object types, and that relationship between a mesh object and an armature object can actually be kind of confusing here. And I want to talk about all the things that happen behind the scenes that kind of seem a little bit like magic. When we selected our mesh, shift selected our armature, and we parented it, our mesh to our armature with automatic weights. So 5 things actually happen behind the scenes with that single operation, and I can actually select this mesh here, and we can go through those different things that happened. On this object data tab here, this little cube icon, I have the mesh selected. We can come down to our relations tab or drop down and look, and we can see that our Eve mesh is parented to our armature object called Rig. So that is one thing that happened behind the scenes. If we go to our modifier tab, we can when we parented with automatic weights, it added an armature modifier to our mesh, and that is when we move our bones here, that's what's helping that move our mesh. So that's object number 2. And if we go to our mesh data tab here, with our Eve mesh selected again, when we parented with automatic weights, Blender actually looked through this rig, looked for every bone that was set to deform in that rig, and it created a vertex group and then assigned vertices to that group, and also assigned weights to each one of those groups. So those are the 5 things that happened. It parented the mesh to a rig, it added an armature modifier, and also created a vertex group for every deformation bone. Remember that in a Rigify rig, this third to last layer here is where our deformation bones reside. Let's go to our bone properties with one of these deformation bones selected, and you can see that it's set to deform. If I actually select one of these rig controls, any one of them, you can see that no deformation option is checked for those, so only these deformation bones. So it created a vertex group for each one of those deformation bones, assigned some vertices to it, and also assigned weights. So let's actually break this down here and talk about some of these other options that happen when we parented with automatic weights. You can see that there's quite a few options to parent meshes. So let's talk about these, and I'm going to use a different file for this. So I have got a pretty simple setup right here. Let me just select this mesh layer. Alright, basically I have my arms mesh here is basically 3 different tubes, and I've kind of changed the topology just a little bit in between each one of these. I'm not going to go through that right now, but I just want you to notice that this lower one is going to be my bad topology example, this one will be my decent topology example, and this top one will be my good topology example. So really simple tubes, just 8 vertices, and like I said, most of this I've just made simple changes in between each one of these. So I also have a subsurf modifier on here. So then I have a very simple armature made up of 2 bones for each arm here. I have arm 1001 and arm 1002, arm 2001 and 002, and arm 3001 and 002. Alright, here, let me make sure that I've got everything set up here so I can my examples are going to work as intended. Alright, so let's just go through parenting a mesh object to an armature object. So I'm going to select the mesh and shift select any bone in that armature, and you can tell that the armature is in pose mode because the bones are blue. Control P. I'm going to set parent to Armature Deform. Let's see what that does. And if I select one of these bones in here, it doesn't look like it's doing anything. It's not deforming that mesh. Let's take a look at the 5 things that need to happen in order for an armature to move our mesh, and check out what that option did for us. We can see that it did parent it to our arm rig. It did add an armature modifier on our mesh, but over here, there's no vertex groups, therefore no vertices assigned to those groups and no weights assigned to those groups. So that's why in pose mode, when we manipulate this, these bones, nothing is actually deforming our arm mesh here. So I do want to show you one thing that you may think is a little bit odd here. I'm going to select my armature and go to object mode, and if I actually select that armature and move that around, you can see the mesh is actually going with it, but in pose mode it's not having any effect. So that might seem a little bit odd to you, but if I show you this little example here, I've got a cube mesh and a sphere mesh, and these are both in object mode here. If I select their sphere and shift select the cube, I'm just going to do Control P, and I'm going to set parent to object. You can see that I've got a parent-child relationship now here. Let's select this sphere that we just parented to the cube and go to our parenting or relations tab here, and you can see that it's parented to our cube. So sphere is parented to the cube. This is basically an object to object type of parenting, and it's basically the same thing that's happened right here. If I'm in object mode, our mesh object is parented to our armature object, but you got to remember that armatures have their special mode. They're the only object in Blender that uses pose mode, and we need to have those vertex groups have vertices assigned to those groups and also have weights on those groups in order for this modifier to work. So that might seem a little bit odd, but I think you can kind of see the object-to-object relationship is there. We're just not seeing it in pose mode right now. Okay, so let me. So parenting with Armature Deform might not seem like it's very useful, but I'm going to show later how we can use that to simplify things for us. I'm not going to show it right now, unfortunately, but bear with me. And select my mesh, Alt P, and let's clear this parent. And if I select that mesh now, you see it's no longer parented to that armature, and our modifier is now gone, and we didn't have any vertex groups anyway, so no problem there. Let's select our mesh, shift select our armature, Control P. Let's try another option here. Let's set parent with empty groups. So just like before, you can see that nothing is happening when I manipulate it in pose mode, but it is parented. We can see that relationship there. If I go to object mode, and we can see it in our, oops, let me select our mesh. We can see it is parented to the arm rig. It did add an armature modifier. That modifier doesn't seem to be working. If we look at our mesh data tab, we do have vertex groups, but I think you can kind of figure this out for yourself. The reason it's not working is because those vertex groups are empty, just like the name implied. We parented with empty groups, so there are no vertices assigned to these vertex groups, and there are no weights assigned to those vertices, so that's not moving. So this once again might seem like it's not very useful, but it's going to come up where in part of my workflow where that option is going to help out. So one other thing we need to I should mention, I talked about before, when we parented with Armature Deform and with empty groups, it cycled through, well, with empty groups this time, it cycled through and looked for each one of these bones in here that was set to deform. So let me actually go to my bone properties here, and you see these lower 4 bones have the deform option checked, but this one on arm 3 does not, and that is why in our vertex groups there are no arm 3, 001 and 002 vertex groups, because they were not set to deform in our armature. So, alright, let's try our third option that we've already done here before. I'm going to select our mesh, Alt P, let's clear our parent, and we can see that it's no longer parented. Our armature modifier is gone, and this time it didn't take off our vertex groups, but we can do this manually by this black down arrow here. You can just do delete all groups and do this one more time. So when you select mesh, shift select armature, Control P. Now let's set parent with automatic weights. Now we should actually see something happen now, as expected. When I rotate this lower arm, it's now affecting that mesh. Again, the 5 things that happen: it is parented to the arm rig, has an armature modifier, And now, because we have vertex groups and vertex weights, because of the automatic weighting, it's actually manipulating that mesh. So it doesn't look very good right now, but no problem. When I manipulate this one, though, you're going to see something really odd happen up here. So what's going on with that? Once again, automatic weight sometimes doesn't do the best job here. And let me just select this mesh here, clear out these rig controls, select the mesh, and go to weight paint mode. And you can see that this bone right here that I have selected, and it's also selected the vertex group on that mesh for me, has about 50% weights on this upper mesh. And this one also has 50% weight, so that's why we're getting this really weird deformation here. So once again, we need to have our bones set to deform. Now if I select these upper ones, you can see that everything went pink. And the reason it went pink when I have these selected is there's no vertex group for these bones. So you're going to see this often when we're weight painting our Rigify rig. When we have rig control selected, everything will turn pink. That it means that the vertex group, or the bone we have selected, there's no vertex group. So it's not really an error so much. You're going to see it a lot, like I said. So if I have one that does have vertex groups and stuff assigned to it, different story. Alright, so pink is one of those things in Blender that if you'll see this a lot in other things too. So for example, if you're trying to reference a material like an image file or something like that, and it doesn't exist and Blender can't find it, you'll see pink. That's one different time you'll see pink. So it's kind of a standard thing. If in Blender, pink means that whatever you're trying to reference doesn't exist. So in this case, when I select the bones with our mesh object in weight paint mode, it doesn't have a vertex group, so that's why it's pink. So don't want to confuse you too much on there. Just don't freak out when you see that pink. Most of the time it's not a problem, but it can show you if you do have a problem. Let me go back to object mode here. And let me select this armature, go to bone properties, which is right next to our armature man icon here, and let's set these to deform so we can redo this one more time. Alt P, let's query our parent, select our mesh, shift select our armature, Control P. Let's do this with automatic weights now, and now we should actually see the proper, what we're probably expecting to happen. So now it's actually working here. So let me move this up. Alright, so that's parenting a mesh to an armature with Armature Deform. Let's talk about a few other things here that are having an effect on how this actually looks. So let's select our mesh. You see it's parented to the arm rig. Let's go back to our modifier tab here. When it added that armature modifier, it just added it to our stack, and right now it's actually below our subsurf. So if you don't know how the modifier stack works on your mesh items, basically it's going to look at the first modifier. It's going to do whatever your modifier is. In this case it's a subsurf modifier, so it's taking every face in here and actually quadrupling it. So it's splitting every face in 4 sections, because I have a view set to 1 right now. So that's what a subsurf modifier does, and then it's spitting that results out to our armature. So an armature modifier position in the stack is actually pretty important, and it can greatly affect how your mesh object deforms with your armature. So I'm going to actually take this armature modifier and bump it up using these. You can move your modifiers in the stack with these arrow buttons. I'm going to move this up to above the subsurf. Just watch over here on what happens, and you can see that it's quite a bit of difference in how that mesh is deformed just by changing that simple thing. So armature's position in the stack is actually pretty important. For efficiency, for one, having an armature modifier above the subsurf is just going to help. So the other way around, it's basically taking our mesh and quadrupling every face in there, so it's actually making that mesh really dense, and then our armature has to move it. So for efficiency wise, having it above is just a good thing to do, because we're taking the unsubdivided mesh, moving those vertices with their bones, then it's going to apply that subsurf on it, and you can see that it just looks a little bit, it looks a little better. So Not only does it look better, it's more efficient for Blender to move unsubdivided meshes. So always have your armature modifier above your subsurface if you can. In most cases, anyways. Alright, one other thing that our armature modifier is going to affect, you can, some of these different toggles, most of these we don't have to worry about. Right now we are bound to Vertex Groups, so it's using Vertex Groups here to move those vertices and the weights in those groups. Bone envelopes is kind of an older method, I won't talk about that, and sometimes it'll come up where this, if you use multiple armature modifiers on a single mesh. Definitely not going to talk about that right now, but this preserve volume checkbox is actually pretty important, and it can have a big effect on how our meshes deform. So let me just kind of zoom in here to this top example here. I just want you to take a look at this elbow right here when I turn on preserve volume, and you can see that I'm getting a lot more volume in this elbow here, the elbow area. So preserve volume, let's take a look at our tooltip. It says deform, rotation, interpolation with quaternions. So that's not very helpful. Don't worry about that. Basically, just think of it this way. Preserve volume is giving us volume preservation for free. So if we're doing an organic mesh like this, like an arm, in most cases we just want to have that on automatically. So I always check that on for any organic type meshes that I am rigging. And a couple other options here that are very useful are these edit mode toggles. This display a modifier in edit mode, and also adjust edit cage to modify results. Let's just take a look at what those do. So I'm going to have the mesh selected. Let me go to edit mode so we can see what those toggles do. You can see that our mesh kind of went back to its base position right here without these toggles on. If I select this first one, it's kind of giving me a split view here. It's showing me the edit mode positions in edit mode, and also kind of showing me the results. So results and the true edit mode positions. And if I select this one and turn that on, it's showing me our edit mode results together. So it's possible to use one or the other. Hopefully I'll get to different examples and show you where this is useful to have these on. I usually just typically have them both on. So that is our armature modifier. Alright, I think that pretty much covers parenting a mesh to an armature with Armature Deform and the things that happen behind the scenes. Let's talk a little bit about how to parent a mesh to an armature that we don't want to deform. So I have another little mesh right here. I just call it armband. For this example, let's just assume that this armband or bracelet thing is made out of hard plastic and it's not going to deform, meaning that when I move this bone here, how this is deforming, we want this to act more like a hard surface. So I can actually show how to parent that, and it's actually pretty easy. So we've got our hard surface plastic bracelet type thing here. All we need to do is select our mesh, shift select the bone that we in our armature that we want to parent it to, Control P. We can set parent directly to our bone. Now when I move that arm, it's going to move exactly with it. I can actually probably scale it up, and it's going to scale relative to that too. So not very useful for arm, but anyways, you can see that the parent-child relationship here, it is parented to arm rig, but now it is set to a bone in that arm, arm 1002. If I select that bone, arm 1002. So I actually have a little bit of an error here, just so I can badger you a little bit about applying locations, rotations, and scales to your objects. Unapplied transforms. Let me actually just bend that arm a little bit here. If I select that mesh, you can see up here that I have unapplied transforms. So locations, rotations, and scales that are not 000 for location and rotation, and scales that are not 111. So that means I have unapplied locations, rotations, and scales. So what does that mean? If I accidentally select this mesh and do Alt-G-R-S, you can see that it's going to go to this really weird position. Basically, now I have unapplied it's zeroed itself back out. That's its default location, rotation, and scale. We do Control Z 3 times here to get that back, and we don't want that to happen. So very easy to fix this. Let me select that mesh, Alt P, clear the parent temporarily, and we can apply these locations, rotations, and scale so that doesn't happen very easily. Select the mesh, Control A, apply the location, rotation, and scale. Let me select the mesh, shift select that bone again, Control P, what's parented to that bone, and now it seems to work the same, but if I accidentally move it, rotate it, or scale it, I can just do Alt GRS, and it's going to go back to where it should. So no, won't have a problem with accidentally making this fly off into nowhere here. So alright, one thing to talk about when we actually parent a mesh directly to a bone. If you go into edit mode of your armature and you manipulate your bone in any way, let me just select this tip here and type GX, just make it a little bit larger. You might see this happen. So if I go back to pose mode, all of a sudden our armband is kind of, it followed it when we moved this out in edit mode. So if that ever happens to you after you've parented a mesh item to a bone in your rig, it's not a big deal, especially if you have applied your transforms. You just select the mesh, do Alt P, temporarily clear the parent, and then you can select the mesh and parent it back to that bone, and no problem. So another reason why you should apply your transforms on your objects. Let me just put this back, GX, and let's go about right there, and I'm going to have to do this again now, but it's going to move it back that direction. Once again, I just do Alt P, just temporarily clear the parent, and then parent it back to that bone, set parent to bone, and no problems. Now I don't remember what those values were before, but I don't think I could ever remember them if I had not applied my transform. So anyways, that is parenting a mesh directly to a bone. Now we could actually do this with an armature modifier as well if we don't want this mesh to deform. So let me just do Alt P, clear the parent, and let's do it with Armature Deform instead. So I'm going to select the mesh, shift select any bone in the rig, Control P, let's set parent with Armature Deform, and it's not going to move with it because we need, we can see that's parented to the arm rig, and it doesn't have an armature modifier, but we don't have any vertex group, so let's just make a vertex group here. We just go plus to make a group, and I'm going to select arm1002, hover over the name, Control C, then get that group here, select it, Control V, paste it in there. Now I have a vertex group for it. Now I just need to go to edit mode, or you can actually do this in weight paint mode as well. I'm going to select all the vertices in there and assign it to arm1002, a weight of 1, assign that, and now we've got basically the same thing we did by parenting it directly to that bone, but now this is using an armature modifier to move that instead. And because all those vertices are only assigned to a single bone, it's not going to deform, right? It'll move with the bone like you'd expect, but it's not going to deform in any way like this unless we added more vertex groups here and weights from another bone. So this is another way we can do that. Add a hard surface mesh, parent an hard surface mesh to our armature, and you'll notice that I'm going to go to edit mode here and do that same thing I did before. GX, just drag this out. It didn't affect it this way, so we didn't have to clear its location, rotation, and scale when we use that method. So whichever method you use to parent your hard surface objects to your armature, a few different ways that you can do that, and a few different pros and cons to each of those methods. I'm actually not going to talk about that right now. I think I'll just confuse the issue. But there we go. Parenting with Armature Deform, parenting directly to a bone. And I think we've covered pretty much everything on the parent-child relationship between the mesh object and an armature object, and how all that stuff works behind the scenes. Next up, I want to talk about weight painting all of these vertices to move with these bones, and how topology is going to affect our deformations. So you can tell when there's quite a bit of difference in between these meshes here on how they're deforming. So in our next lesson, I want to break that down and kind of take all the mystery out of weight painting and editing weights, because that's something I think that really affects everybody's skinning. So until next time, I hope this helps, and good luck.